Hi everybody and welcome back to another Tonight Talks. This is the next talk in our series on myth-busting some of the common misconceptions around neurodiversity. And today we're going to be looking at exploring neurodiversity and affirming approach. Again, we're very lucky for Catherine Bailey to be joining us for this series. And today she's going to be talking us through what an affirming approach is. Would you mind just giving us a little bit of an overview of what we're going to cover today, Catherine, if that's okay?
Yeah, no problem, Caitlin. Well, I'm sure we've all heard that word in the media quite frequently, neurodiversity. So hopefully, by the end of the session, we'll have a clear understanding of what neurodiversity is and how it differs from neurodevelopmental disorders, because the two often can become easily confused. And also to think about some of the debates around neurodiversity and some of the challenges to this approach.
Oh, fantastic. Let's make a start. So, Catherine, what is the difference between neurodiversity and neurodevelopmental disorders?
Okay, so neurodiversity recognises that every human is different and varies in presentation. No one individual is the same as another. Our brains are as unique to us as our fingerprints, and we refer to this as being heterogeneous. The term neurodiversity does not belong to one group in society. We are all neurodiverse, and everyone is responsible for equality, diversity, inclusion, and belonging. Neurodevelopmental disorders, on the other hand, are a diagnostic family of 8 disorders. This family of cousins includes attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, language disorder, learning disability, dyspraxia, dyslexia, dyscalculia, and tic disorders, including Tourette's. This is very much a medical model with criteria from international diagnostic manuals, the ICD-11 or the DSM-5, with the emphasis on disorder and difference. The two terms, ND and neurodiversity, can co-occur to identify someone's profile of strengths, difference, and needs through assessment with or without a diagnosis. Then plan person-centered support by making changes to our environment and enabling people around us to understand and to adapt to our needs.
Okay, so you said in there that there's these kind of two ideas around kind of neurodiversity and neurodevelopmental disorders. You've got neurodiversity, which is more of a kind of affirming approach, and you've got neurodevelopmental disorders, which follows kind of a medical
That's right.
model. So I'm
That's
wondering from there, how does neurodiversity actually challenge the biomedical model of neurodevelopmental disorders?
Yeah, so this challenge is rooted in the notion that the environment, not the individual, is the challenge. Therefore, research now is refocusing on approaches, and our energies are spent on providing enabling environments in terms of support to make sure what we are doing is enabling and not excluding or even unhelpful. So the focus is around adapting the environment to meet the strengths and needs of the individual, not the individual having to make changes to their own personalities in order to fit in with the environment. So in essence, clinical research and practice is now taking a far more neuroaffirmative approach.
Well, that's really positive, isn't it? To hear that we're moving forward in the way in which we think about neurodiversity and the way in which we support it.
Absolutely.
Okay, so considering that, I suppose there is that question of, are neuroaffirming approaches maybe denying the reality of disability?
Yeah, I mean, this is something again which can be part of the debate around neuroaffirming approaches. And I think the central message really is that the brain traits differ across the population. Differences are the normal part of the spectrum of what it is to be human. Differences bring richness to society rather than a focus on difficulties, disorder, or stigma. So challenging the classification of disorder, is not denying the reality of a disability. Let's talk about labels. They can be powerful, and therefore it's so important that we look at the language we use to describe difference. For example, stimming would traditionally be frowned upon, but stimming is incredibly important and helpful for children in terms of regulation. You wouldn't take a pair of glasses off a child, for example, who had poor eyesight. In the same way, stimming is performing an adaptive function in terms of regulation. So it's considered a difference, not a deficit. In another podcast on busting the myths around autism, we talked about Milton's double empathy problem. This is a perfect example of breaking down barriers, not creating them, moving from an idea of disorder to difference.
Okay, so neuroaffirming approaches actually focusing on developing our understanding and developing a way in which we can live together in the world that, even though it is built for neurotypicals, that actually those who are neurodiverse can thrive in these environments.
Absolutely.
So I suppose there's a question there of whether neuroaffirming approaches exclude people from the support they may need. If we're kind of having this focus on kind of strengths and positive elements, is there a risk there of it kind of putting up a barrier to needed support?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I think, we need to debunk myths and misconceptions where we value differences regardless of needs. It's really important to note that reframing difficulties as differences does not advocate that people do not need support. And the medical model is certainly not excluded. So, for example, we know anxiety can be an important component of difference and would require medical intervention. But the key question is, how do you provide good neurodiverse care and support? Neuroaffirming approaches continue to embrace the notion that people will need interventions and support. So research is now moving towards a strengths-based model where we look at the function of the difference. So, for example, I've already mentioned stimming. Is it adaptive in that it's helpful for anxiety, or is it maladaptive? If it's maladaptive, then what can we change in the environment to help and support that individual? What environments are enabling or proving challenging to people? One of the controversies and debates around the concept of neurodiversity is that it excludes people from the support that they may need. There can be a misreading of what it is to be neurodiverse or neurodifferent. It's really so important, Caitlin, to listen to people who can offer an internal perspective on what they need in terms of support to make sure what we are doing is enabling, not excluding or even unhelpful.
Absolutely. We want to empower individuals and we want to have their voice at the centre of their support. Because otherwise, it's not going to be as effective. One thing I think has been a theme through this talk has been the language. You talk about the difference between disorder and difference. So when we're taking a neuro affirming approach, how can we adapt our language to be in accordance with that?
Absolutely. It's so important, Caitlin. You're quite right. And language goes through, all the debates and the way we approach difference and disorder in our environments. So there's a work group within CAPTAP, which stands for Community Against Prejudice Towards Autistic People. And the work group have produced a guide about the way autistic people are spoken about, which has been decided by autistic people, not researchers, not clinicians, but actually written by autistic people themselves. So the guide has incorporated research and papers and has found a common language that the majority of autistic people are comfortable with. And they've produced guidance for us to make sure that we are using neuroaffirming language. So I think the three key principles in the guidance are, try not to think of autism as being a disorder rather than a difference. that we try and translate medical language into identity affirming language. This is quite difficult because obviously in some cases on official paperwork, for example, you will be required, or there will be a requirement to use diagnostic language, and that can tend to focus a lot on deficits and lacking. So wherever possible, when talking to autistic people and their families, the diagnostic terminology should be translated into the style of language, which is much more neuroaffirming. And also, the third principle really is about respecting the individual. If the autistic person you're talking to expresses a specific preference for the language you use, then this should be respected. So some of the key messages in the guidance is that we should avoid calling autism spectrum disorder, ASD or ASC, and just call it autism, or just talk about being autistic. Secondly, rather than talking about a person with autism, use person first language. So describe people with autism as an autistic person. This is far more embracing and takes on the notion that being autistic is an integral and valid part of a person's identity. Thirdly, don't say high functioning or low functioning, or use level. Instead, talk about specific needs for support, access, or accommodation. And the spectrum, we've already talked about this in a previous podcast, does not mean from low functioning to high functioning or from mild to severe. The word spectrum is better thought of in the sense of a colour spectrum, not a linear spectrum or a scale. As we've said previously, each person has different skills and challenges in different aspects of their functioning. And again, don't talk about treating autism or interventions to treat autism. Instead, talk about support services, therapies, or strategies to improve a person's quality of life. Autistic people do not need to be treated. They don't have an illness. Being autistic is a valid way of being and does not inherently require medical intervention. Another principle is not to talk of profound or severe or mild autism. Instead, explain what the person's challenges are, or whether they also have a learning disability. So when we stop thinking of being autistic as having a disorder, then it does not really make sense to talk about severity. Again, a further principle, don't say that someone does not look autistic. There is no autistic look. We hear about this a lot in our day-to-day lives. Saying someone does not look autistic upholds harmful stereotypes. All autistic people are different, as we've said, because all people are different. Adults can be autistic, women and girls can be autistic, people who hold eye contact and have conversations can be autistic, people who are friends can be autistic. So saying you don't look autistic can feel very invalidating to this person who suspects or knows they are. So in summary, it's really, really important not to use pathologizing language and to talk about differences in a much more neuro-affirming, positive way.
If you guys are interested in having a look through this guide and seeing some kind of top tips on how you can adapt your language, then we'll provide a link to the guide below so you can access that and have a look through it. And we hope that this talk in general has been helpful, Catherine, don't we? And we just want to say a huge diolch yn fawr. Thank you so much for joining us today for our kind of second talk in this series on exploring neurodiversity and affirming approach. And as always, guys, there's a QR code there that you can scan to gain access to our live sessions. We have 2 more talks coming up in this series, and from there we're going to have some more some other traditional tonight talks available for you guys. But thank you so much for tuning in today.
Thanks, everyone.
And we hope to see you soon.